As Winston said, I'm Aaron Sironi. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor in Montana. And 5 years ago, almost to the day, I sat where you're sitting this morning. I wasn't a pastor, wasn't in ministry, and I certainly was not a biblical counselor. But I wasn't new to counseling. I had 4 years at a leading Christian graduate school in psychology, had excellent postgraduate training in marriage and family therapy. And after that, had been working in the field for a while, was very close, just hours within licensure, when I pulled the plug and said, I'm done. You see, about a year and a half before attending that conference back in 2004, before I left the field altogether, I began to get disheartened, discouraged with the psychological therapeutic field as a whole, and never felt at home fully as a Christian, as a believer. And it only made it worse when I would read or listen to Christian psychologists or Christian therapists repackaging, reinterpreting psychological theories and calling it Christian. Likewise, I was discouraged sitting in the pews at church and hearing a pastor give a sermon and then using a psychological concept or a technique as the action point. I sat there and I said, no, that's not Christianity. That's not what moves me. That's not what transformed my life. Don't we have something to offer? Don't we have something inherently Christian that changes everything, that has changed indeed my life? I couldn't quite articulate these thoughts, but I felt them very deeply. I knew we as believers had something unique, something more powerful, something more profound, something that was life-changing altogether. I knew the gospel, and I had been transformed by our Redeemer. But I also knew the psychologies. I knew they were helpful. I knew they were full of techniques. I knew they were rich in observations. Who wouldn't? I'd studied them for years. Who wouldn't want to study from people who'd sat for thousands, tens of thousands of hours with people struggling in the trenches each day? But they did not bring me or anybody else to Christ, to the gospel. The field is populated. You probably know Christian counselors, you know psychologists, social workers. They care deeply for the people they meet with each day, and they're compassionate, and they're walking with them. But the psychological theories that I had learned and I had utilized never led me or my counselees to Jesus, to the cross. In fact, they felt like parallel tracks, Christianity and psychology. And the more I walked, I thought they would meet in the horizon, but they never did. The psychologies placed the individual and his or her relational system at the center of the universe, right? Each encourages the protection and promotion of the individual, what I want, what I feel, what I need, what I expect. They make that focal. Self-centeredness and self-reliance, even self-confidence, is engendered. But which of the psychology leads and reveals the gospel? As believers, isn't it true that we develop an ear for the gospel? And each time that we hear it, either from a sermon, in the word ourselves, or and see it in the lives of our friends and those around us, aren't we moved deeply? Why don't we hear this melody in the psychologies? What place does forgiving as God forgives me today, whose mercies are new every moment of the day, what place does that have, let's say, in systems theory? Does cognitive behavioral therapy aid me in determining and seeing clearly what Christ-defined rationality or irrationality is? Does it open my eyes to the Lord who is near and to the one before whose eyes we live. True rationality leads us out of my very small world of self-talk and into a conversation with the living God who intends me to know him, to depend upon him, to need him, and to love him. Right? Each monochromatic psychological theory is indeed idolatrous in its own way and does not only lead us or keep us from our Savior, but it does not definitely lead us to a compassionate, gracious, just, and merciful Redeemer. In my own counseling, at the end of the day, my counselees had experienced, certain positive changes. I addressed physiology, family history, trauma, relational dynamics, etc., but I had not done so in relation to our Creator, to our Judge, to our Redeemer. So how did I find myself at the CCEF conference back in 2004? Well, I was out of the field for a year and a half, had prayed, Lord, I don't ever want to go back. I was doing accounting, bookkeeping, and I loved it. At the end of, I got in the car and went to work every day, and oh man, it was good. I knew by the end of the day, I would have solved 80 to 150 problems. I could go home and I'd leave the work there. And if it did get a little messy, I could journal entry it away and forget about it. No mess was worth making, in accounting. Yeah, that lasted for about 6 months. That soon wore off. And the Lord started to speak to me and call me back. I was a sincere believer who was built to walk with people, as you are too, as we all are, and to walk wisely in a way that points them to our Savior. Well, how did I get to CCEF? There's a wise elder in my church who was meeting with my wife and invited me, and he knew that I had left the field of psychotherapy and started to engage me. He consulted with me. He was working in counseling for years. And he'd say, Aaron, what would you do with this situation? And I very vividly remember him asking me one morning, it was early in the morning, he said, Aaron, I'm working with a woman who's suffering from a chronic disease. She experiences pain every day of her life. How would you counsel her? And I gave it my best shot. He said, that's all? He said, what does the gospel say to this woman? It's like he came out of his seat with excitement. He said, how can we help her to see her suffering through God's eyes? How can we help her to address her willful heart of worship, even amidst her suffering? How can we help her find God's mercies and God's comfort? And I was stunned. I said, yeah, I don't know. But I want to know. And in that moment, I would consider that my moment of conversion to biblical counseling. And I said, yes, this is what moves me. I don't have to leave what moved me on Sunday morning behind when I go Monday through Friday. I can go in there, I can give people what has changed my life, which changed my relationship with my wife, which has changed my panic and my deepest fears. Right? It was that moment that I knew that I could never return to counseling as I knew it. So, some of you here have been touched by true biblical counsel. And that's why you're here. And you want to learn more and to grow in grace and mercy and in helping others walk along this path. Some of you here are seeing biblical counseling for the first time and just now tasting it. And I say to you, welcome. Welcome home. Welcome to the banquet. Those of you, well, we all know Christian counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists. How do we approach them? Yeah. These believers have had a lot of clinical training. They've worked hard to obtain licensure and to build counseling practices. And many of us who are licensed, yeah, we do struggle with issues of jurisdiction and counseling authority. But don't see a licensed Christian as an enemy or a competitor, but as a brother or a sister. Do not assume that they are not seeking for deeper biblical foundations to their counseling. In fact, assume the opposite, that they're not satisfied. And engage them, build relationships with them. Win them as you were won through the gospel, applied to the deepest struggles of life and of death.